Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, Schooling the Nation, the Success of the Canterbury Academy for Black Women, with author Jennifer Rycenga. This program is part of our series at the American Antiquarian Society called Women Make History. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Scott Casper, and I'm the president of AAS. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources that AAS has been collecting since 1812. We welcome researchers from around the world to use the collections, and also researchers right here in our home of Worcester, Massachusetts. Though the collections are both physical and digital, we also host programs like tonight's that provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. The program you're watching tonight is being recorded, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel afterward. My colleague, Lauren Havelis, who's coordinating the technology this evening, will be posting some notes in the chat, including how to order the book and also how to ask questions using the Q&A function, which you can do at any point during this program. We thank you for joining us this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. Now I'm happy to introduce tonight's speaker, who's a familiar face here at the American Antiquarian Society, having conducted research here for 25 years. Jennifer Rycenga is Professor Emerita in the Humanities Department at San Jose State University. Her scholarly work has focused on the abolitionist movement, exploring areas previously hidden or marginalized, such as Black women's activities and voices, philosophic analyses of the work of Black speaker Mariah Stewart, the anti-racist work of white abolitionists, and networks of families and friends involved in the struggles against slavery and injustice. She has led 2 digital humanities projects concerning the Burley family of Plainfield, Connecticut, who were 7 siblings who all supported Prudence Crandall and the Canterbury School, and we'll have links to those 2 digital humanities projects available in the chat. Jennifer Rycenga's brand new book, published in 2025 by the University of Illinois Press, is called Schooling the Nation, the Success of the Canterbury Academy for Black Women, and that's what she'll talk about tonight. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate that introduction, and I have so enjoyed the 25 years I've been researching at the American Antiquarian Society. I want to thank you and Nan Wolverton, Lauren Havelis, and Nathan Fisk, especially for helping to make this program a reality. And I want to say that it is an honor to speak to an audience of the Friends of the American Antiquarian Society. I remain forever grateful and indebted to archives and archival librarians for retaining the artifacts and traces from which scholars and researchers can rebuild lives that were marginalized. I must, though, note that this is a fraught moment when the National Archives of the United States is under criticism and attack from politicians. Tonight, I will share a story of hope from a similarly difficult time of creating political change by those who, to use the language of later movements, kept their eyes on the prize that is human learning and mutual recognition of our shared humanity. So with that, I'm going to go to the slides here, and let me just get that started. And so I'm going to be focusing on the Canterbury Female Academy, sometimes called Prudence Crandall School, but I think she would prefer to see it as a shared venture, because this is a story really about alliances and persistence in pursuit of learning. The Canterbury Female Academy is a pivotal moment in the abolitionist struggle. It takes place over a 2-year span, from the fall of 1832 until September of 1834. Many different groups that I've labeled here will play a part in making the Canterbury Female Academy come to life. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the historic context. It started in 1831, and then in 1832, there was a key moment when three women were able to recognize each other and each other's desire for learning. And then in 1833, the full abolitionist coalition comes to support the Canterbury Female Academy. 1831 is perhaps the most significant year in American history that nobody calls that, except maybe me. William Lloyd Garrison, on January 1st, launched The Liberator. 1 week later, on January 8th, in his second issue, he published David Walker's Appeal, which was published posthumously, and William Lloyd Garrison even said he wasn't sure he agreed with all of it, but he recognized the importance of the work. And this is one of the first major anti-racist moments we have of recognizing each other as intellectual equals and debate partners, in essence. Lydia Maria Child, who was the Martha Stewart of her day, joined the abolitionist movement as a writer and editor. She had already written Hobomok, the first novel in American history to deal with an interracial marriage between a Native American and a white woman. And so she was primed and ready to join the abolitionist movement, which she did, and that hurt her own career in sales, but went on to give her lasting fame as an editor and writer. In August of 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved Black man, led what was probably the best planned uprising against slavery in Virginia before being defeated by white militias. While he was still on the lam, Maria Stewart, a Black woman, walked into William Lloyd Garrison's offices in Boston and presented him with a manuscript, which he promptly published, of her writings. And then the next year, she started to speak publicly, becoming the first American-born woman to address a political audience made up of both men and women, Black and white. And from that ferment of Boston, Mariah Davis, a Black woman, probably from a working class background, moved to Canterbury, Connecticut, sometime in late 1831 or early 1832, where she took a job as the household helper for Prudence Crandall, who was a white woman leading a select academy in the style of Catherine Beecher's academy and similar institutions across the Northeast. Mariah Davis was moving to Canterbury because her fiance lived there. Charles Harris was his name. The Harris family was a very active family in Canterbury, and I'll return to them in a moment. But there's one other thing that happened in 1831 that's important. There was an effort by the abolitionists to open a manual labor college for men in New Haven that would be a complement to Yale. And this was rejected in a decisive vote of 700-4. This was the first effort by Black abolitionists and white abolitionists to work together as part of the immediate abolition movement. The work of that particular coalition, though, obviously was unsuccessful. And recently, Tobias Cooper, Charles Warner Jr., and Michael Moran, working through the Beinecke Library at Yale, have made this story and its costs far better known. And I would recommend to you their short film, What Could Have Been, about the failed manual labor college. The reason for the failure was the colonization movement's opposition to education for African Americans. The opposition was based on the idea that educating African Americans in the United States might make them more likely to want to remain in the United States, rather than the colonizationist plan to repatriate them to Africa, whether or not they had ever lived in Africa. It was a veiled attempt at what we would now call ethnic cleansing. This defeat of the Manual Labor College was the high watermark for proponents of colonization. They would once again be the adversaries opposed to the Canterbury Female Academy. So on to Canterbury, for those of you unfamiliar with Connecticut geography, this is located just south of Worcester County in Massachusetts. It is the northeast corner of Connecticut. It has a number of nicknames. Of course, the whole state of Connecticut used to be called the Land of Steady Habits. Windham County in particular, known as the Quiet Corner. The circled area contains Canterbury, Plainfield, and Brooklyn, the three municipalities most involved in the Academy controversy. The closest large cities to Canterbury were in Norwich and New London to the south. There were free Black populations in the cities, just mentioned, as well as throughout Windham County. But even they were fairly small and often based around seafaring occupations. So as I was saying, Mariah Davis, when she came from Boston to Canterbury, was moving to Connecticut because she had somehow met Charles Harris. And so before the wedding, she was going to find work in the area. Charles's father, William Harris, was the local agent for the Liberator. So Mariah Davis had regular access to the Liberator, both from her background in Boston and in the home of her future in-laws. When she had her job working at Crandall's Academy, she noticed that her employer, the teacher, seemed to have a conscience, and she decided that she would bring Crandall copies of the Liberator. We do not know if she did this passively or actively. In other words, did she just bring them and leave them lying around, or did she hand them to the teacher and say, you really ought to read these? But regardless of which it was a daring move for a teenage woman in her first full-time job to bring what was largely considered an incendiary paper into her place of employ. Crandall did, however, read it, and this first vetting of her moral conscience was apparently strong enough that Mariah Davis suggested to her future sister-in-law, Sarah Harris, that she could approach Crandall and ask if she could be admitted to Crandall's Academy. Sarah Harris's family, as I mentioned, was a large family, fairly prominent. They were landowners, farmers in Canterbury. And they were also members of one of the local congregational churches. Sarah Harris was the oldest daughter in the family, and she wanted to gain enough education to be able to become a teacher to other African Americans. She asked Crandall at least twice, because Crandall says that she persisted. And Crandall finally decided that she would admit her, and I'll come back to that part of the story in a moment. Prudence Crandall was born in Rhode Island, but her family moved to Connecticut when she was fairly young. She was a birthright Quaker. She did join in her own name later and attended Moses Brown School in Providence. Once she returned to Connecticut, she was teaching in the district schools, but then was converted to the Baptists in what was a classic Second Great Awakening conversion that included an element of societal reform and perfectionism. She was chosen to be the lead teacher of what was meant to be a prestigious new female academy in Canterbury by the town's leaders. When Sarah Harris was asking permission to join the school, Prudence Crandall decided to conduct what's called a talismanic biblical reading. She opened the Bible to a random passage, and she chose Ecclesiastes, which I think was an unfortunate first choice, being that that is perhaps the single most depressing and world-weary text of the Bible. But she opened to chapter 4, verse 1. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. Behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, they had no comforter. And on the side of the oppressors, there was power, but they had no comforter, meaning the oppressed. So she took that as a definite sign that she was meant to be on the side of the oppressed. And she even said that the readings she had done from the Liberator showed her how oppressed the free Black people of the North were. So she uses that as her reasoning. And once she admits Sarah Harris, she stands by her because, hang on a second, doesn't want to go forward. There we go. These three women, Mariah Davis, Sarah Harris, and Prudence Crandall, spark each other. And once that spark has been lit and they understand that they're seeing a greater purpose for the education of women, that leads them to other transformative changes. What a dear friend of mine called a luminous moment. And indeed, I feel it does illuminate the rest of what happens. Because these three women were casting a stone into a pool of complacency. That pool of complacency well represented by that 700-4 vote in New Haven. They created far more ripples than scholars had been able to confirm prior to the 21st century. And my book attempts to present a microscopic look at a movement for social change as it's near its inception. The white parents did not react well to Sarah Harris being admitted as a student. We don't have any record of the other white students being bothered by this, but their parents clearly were, because it interfered with the purpose of a female academy. The purpose of a female academy was more to polish a woman for an MRS degree, not to further her education in a broader sense, let alone conduct a massive social experiment of integration. When Crandall realized that the objections of the parents would likely lead to the loss of students for her, she thought it might be a better idea to reopen the school for Black women only, and then there wouldn't be any objections from the parents. She wrote to William Lloyd Garrison, and she mentions, "I have not met you previously, except through the medium of the press, but this is my idea, that maybe there would be enough Black families in the Northeast that I could maintain my school." She went to meet Garrison in Boston. He agreed, and he gave her a set of contacts. Those contacts included Black and white abolitionists in Providence, Rhode Island, and a host of Black ministers in New York City. She first went to Providence, where she met with Elizabeth Hammond, who was a widow keeping a boarding house. It's important to consider that for any woman keeping a boarding house, her respectability publicly was a very important part of the reputation of her business. So Elizabeth Hammond was immediately convinced of Crandall's sincerity, to the point that she introduced her to all of the Black families in Providence that she knew personally. Crandall obtained at least half a dozen students from Providence that we know. From there, Crandall traveled on to New York City, where she met with at least 6 African-American ministers. Now, I will put this in perspective. Prudence Crandall at this point is a single white woman in her late 20s, traveling to New York City, where she's meeting with African-American men. That was certainly unorthodox behavior. What's far more impressive to me, and I think more meaningful for our own era, is that she was able to convince those Black ministers of her sincerity and her political acumen quickly enough that they supplied somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 students to the school over its lifespan, and spoke of her in endorsements and newspaper articles. And it shows in the advertisement that the Liberator ran for the Canterbury Female Academy. And the first thing to note is that Prudence Crandall referred to her prospective students, African-American students, as young ladies and little misses of color. In the rhetoric of the 19th century, these were terms of respect that were not usually used for Black women. What's even more important to note politically is that she was assuming they were young ladies and little misses of color. They didn't have to come and prove it to her first. And this is important for any member of marginalized communities to realize. Below is the list of endorsers for the school. And this was both, as I say here, practical and political. The practical side was that you needed African American leaders, and that would have been largely men at the time, who are going to vouch for the school before Black parents are going to trust their daughters to attend it. But it was also political because the names were arranged by location rather than race, and no endorser's race is specified. Furthermore, all of the Black men on this list are addressed with their full titles, either Reverend or Mr. And again, Mr. is often reserved as a title of respect in that era. So the abolitionist interracial male network is made visible here even more strongly than it was in the case of the New Haven Manual Labor College. And it's being done in the cause of Black women's higher education taught by a white woman. And so we can see here all of the particular strands of American thought coming together in a representative way. You could consider it structurally as these four groups of Black and white men and women. And so Black women convince a white woman to understand the magnitude of the crisis for African Americans. And then we have the Black Abolitionist Network activating itself in a way that was more effective than what had happened 2 years previously. We also see the abolitionist press, including the establishment of a newspaper based in Brooklyn that would be writing favorably about the Academy. That's called The Unionist. And the American Antiquarian Society holds a unique copy of this paper, which I will show in a few moments. The Crandall legal team included William Ellsworth, a future governor of Connecticut, who was the son of the third Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Oliver Ellsworth. His arguments for Black citizenship were so strong that they have to be forcefully refuted by Roger Taney in the infamous Dred Scott decision, and then finally affirmed in the host of decisions that accompanied Brown v. Board in the 1950s. There was growing white local support, the Benson family, which was Garrison's own future in-laws, the Burley family. The Brooklyn Female Anti-Slavery Society was formed in support of the Canterbury Academy, and that included Olive Gilbert, who would become the ghostwriter for Sojourner Truth's first autobiography, and the Plainfield Anti-Slavery Society, which was the starting point for James Monroe, not the president, but later the president of Oberlin and a fine abolitionist. The Burley family of Plainfield, Connecticut, is one of the groups of 7 siblings that was mentioned in the introduction. And they go on to very long careers and never forget Canterbury. And this is important because what it means is this family had daily contact with African Americans, the students themselves, their families, and the friends of the school. And they used that to fuel their own anti-abolitionist work over the decades. This is the copy of The Unionist that is held at the American Antiquarian Society. It's a very important copy dating from September of 1833, containing the trial transcripts for the first trial of Crandall under the Black Law. It also contains a letter to the editor from a Black male abolitionist. And it is also, there's a similar paper that was opposed to Crandall that the American Antiquarian Society holds from May of 1833 that contains some of the news of the Black Law being passed. So the Canterbury Academy ran for about 1.5 years, from April of 1833 to early September of 1834. And the remarkable thing is that the students and their teachers were able to balance amplifying the causes of abolition and anti-slavery in which they were involved, but they also bought themselves enough time to gain the education that the students sought. And the most interesting signifier of this, I believe, is that the students never revealed each other's names. The names of the students we have come largely from the trial transcripts, and from later memoirs, obituaries, letters, and so on. So they were aware that those who were committing acts of vigilante violence against them and just the usual daily harassment, that those people would be strengthened if they knew the names of the students. More than 10 students went on to become abolitionist activists. Another 6 and probably more became teachers themselves. At least 3 of them traveled abroad and were active in the international anti-slavery movement. And of the 4 white abolitionist teachers at the school, Prudence was joined by her sister Elmira, and Mary Burley and her brother William Henry Burley were the others. I put this slide up whenever I present because the students have far too often been elided as simply ciphers or students, and in fact, they are far more interesting than that. This is the full list as we know it now. And any names that don't have small marks by them are names where I'm searching for more information. And who better to help me out than people who are already friends of the American Antiquarian Society? So please take a look at the names. Take a picture of the slide if you want. I'm happy to supply it later as well. But as you can understand, trying to access records on teenaged African American women is particularly hard, both because they don't always have enough information, and also because their names are likely to change. You can also see the use of initials here for some, and some which are just maddeningly difficult, like Polly Freeman. We don't know if Polly was her real name or if that was a nickname. Freeman, for obvious reasons, was a common last name in the African American community. And so then we are in no wise helped by the 1830 census, only including heads of household and not including the names of the dependents within a household. So the challenges are many, and yet we have still managed, when I say we, me and many other scholars, to uncover a lot more information than we had when we started. When the school itself was in session, Sarah Harris wrote a letter to one of her sisters who was living in New London. And this letter was recently rediscovered, buried in an old news article from the early 20th century in a New London newspaper. And she writes there, our cause will be the means of arousing the nations to their duty with respect to the condition of our colored population and be the means of allaying the prejudice of Americans. I'm not sure that she was entirely correct, but I agree with her impulse here. But she was seeing herself as a self-conscious agent of change, as was Prudence Crandall the same year when she says, I have put my hand to the plow and I will never, no, never look back. So the students and their teachers, as I said, remain steadfast in their dedication to learning. Canterbury exudes the exhilaration of a community engaged in transformation. They're doing what is necessary while realizing that they may not have the luxury of longevity, which of course gives a sense of urgency to all of this. And I feel strongly that a school should be judged by its alumni and their impact, and not only by its longevity. And thus, this quote from a student letter that was published in the Liberator soon after the school closed. She wrote, I have found among my fellow students simple manners and intelligent minds. And there, if anywhere, love was without dissimulation. My teacher was ever kind. With him, I saw religion not merely adopted as an empty form, but a living, all-pervading principle of action. He lived like those who seek a better country. The students' experience included, in addition to their usual curriculum and reading the Bible, reading the abolitionist press. This very important volume in the history of anti-racism, Thoughts on African Colonization, was written by William Lloyd Garrison. Well, the first half of it was written by William Lloyd Garrison. The second half was his compilation of all of the African American meetings around the country that had objected to the colonization schemes that were being foisted on the Black community. It is likely that every single one of those African American women at Canterbury knew an author who was represented in this collection. So it was highly personalized. It was the publication itself was distributed through the same networks as the Liberator. The students were studying philosophy. I will come back to that specifically later. And they had to participate in both trials and reading the press, as their own citizenship and their own right to education were quite literally on trial. Oh, and then daily insults and vigilante violence, which I think is difficult for anybody, but I think it's particularly difficult for young women because the average age of these students was 16 and a half. The Black law made it illegal for anyone to harbor out-of-state Blacks for purposes of education. Clearly, this was a post facto law. Clearly, it was unconstitutional on many grounds. Prudence Crandall was arrested for having violated this law, which, by the way, passed the Connecticut Assembly easily in 1833. She was arrested and she was put in jail for an evening. And this is my only direct quote from my book, that further evidence of Crandall's own political perspicacity emerges in the first postscript to her letter from jail. She wrote a letter to the editor of the Liberator. Said, "Will you please send your Liberator the term of 6 months to Lydia Congdon, Jewett City, she having paid to me for your agent, Mr. William Harris, the sum of $1. Do not fail to send her one next week." Reflect for a moment on this. Prudence Crandall in prison takes the time to ensure that a recent Black woman subscriber with whom she dealt directly will receive her copy of the Liberator. She also reveals that she remains in regular contact with Sarah Harris's father, William Harris, especially in his role as agent for the Liberator. To borrow a leftist idiom, Prudence Crandall was performing movement work, growing the alliance she had helped actualize with her school. Even the connection with Anna Benson, who volunteered to stay with Crandall overnight, can be seen as an example of this coalition building. In this brief jailhouse epistle, Crandall interacts by name with a Black man, white male allies, a Black woman, and shares her cell with a white woman. Crandall envisioned and actualized a different kind of America in that moment. And this particular drawing comes from a fictionalization of the Crandall and Canterbury story by Elizabeth Yates back in the 1950s. It makes her look like a Quaker martyr about to go and be hung. But no, that's far too passive. But the trials were difficult. There were 4 separate legal cases in that mere year and a half that the school was open. The trials that I have highlighted here in black were the trials for which we have extensive testimony from the students. They both ended with a positive result for the Canterbury Academy. The students were heroes who were put into a perilous situation, being set up, and by the way, the law demanded that they be set up to damage their own education, as well as their friends and allies, their own citizenship, and the hard-won respectability of their parents. William Ellsworth realized that they were putting themselves in double jeopardy and asked them to take the fifth, which they did until the prosecution lawyers were able to force them to speak by threatening them with jail and then bringing in someone who was from Connecticut and therefore had to speak. But these students were poised, intelligent, and savvy throughout. And again, I'm not trying to make fun of 16-and-a-half-year-olds. I was once one too, but I do think it's the age at which it's hardest to avoid the occasional sigh or eye roll at the foolishness of one's elders. And yet these women did. the reporter for the Connecticut Post lauded their courage and their fortitude in this alien theater. Vigilante violence happened to the school constantly, included refusal of drinking water, polluting the water with cow dung, eggs and rocks were thrown at the school, taunts, jeers, and noisemakers whenever the students appeared. And the students and the staff tried to take this in stride, even keeping the rocks as keepsakes on the mantelpiece. Here's what one student wrote about it in May of 1833. She said, "The Canterburyans are savage. They will not sell Miss Crandall an article at their shops. My ride from Hartford to Brooklyn was very unpleasant, being made up of blackguards. I came on foot from here to Brooklyn," meaning from Canterbury to Brooklyn, Connecticut. "But the happiness I enjoy here pays me for all. The place is delightful. All that is wanting to complete the place is civilized men. Last evening the news reached us that the new black law had passed. The bell rang and a cannon was fired for half an hour. Where is justice? In the midst of all this, Miss Crandall is unmoved. When we walk out, horns are blown and pistols fired." Over the lifetime of the school, though, the vigilante violence increased. Students were refused medical attention. They were refused seating in the congregational church that was across the way. And an arson fire was set by someone in the village in January of 1834. An African-American friend of the school, Frederick Olney, was visiting that day. He helped to put the fire out. For this great act of valor, he was put on trial by the white opposition. They said that he had started it to gain more attention for the school. The students came through at his trial even more brilliantly than they had at the first black law trial. He was not only exonerated, the jury didn't even take 15 minutes to come back with an acquittal. But then, in the only known act of physical violence around the school, a black and white cat was murdered, and its fur was placed over the fence around the school as a warning. And again, you didn't have to read too deeply to figure out what the warning was. That particular warning came in July of 1834, just as things were heating up in anti-abolitionist riots around the country. What were the students being taught? They were reading philosophy by Jonathan Diamond, an English shopkeeper who was writing a moral philosophy that was uncompromising, that had no time for expediency, but rather pushed for moral absolutes. Among those was nonviolence and trying to end war. So one student wrote in August of 1833, "We as a body, my dear schoolmates, are subject to many trials and struggles, and we all know to what they are attributable. It is the prejudice the whites have against us that causes us to labor under so many disadvantages. They are so prejudiced against us, they will not suffer us to come up and be sharers in any of their privileges. O prejudice, heaven grant thy reign may be short. My friends, although the white people may be so enraged against us as to try to break down every benevolent effort that is made in our behalf and put every obstacle they can in our way to prevent our progress, you are aware that ever since we have been under Miss Crandall's instructions, it has been her utmost care to persuade us not to indulge in angry feelings towards our enemies. With unceasing and untiring earnestness has she pled with us to forgive them. And now let us try to abide by her counsel and feel at peace with all men." And I stress a little bit of tension there. Let us try to abide by nonviolence. It must have been difficult some days. And indeed, one of the students at Canterbury was Julia Williams, who later marries Henry Highland Garnett, the Malcolm X of the 19th century, who himself, he and his family had self-liberated from slavery. Henry Highland Garnett credits his wife, Julia Williams, with being the only person to preview his famous 1843 speech in Buffalo, urging slaves to rebel physically against their oppressors. I think that Williams' tacit endorsement of her husband's speech is a strong example of the intellectual maturity, that freedom of critical thinking skills that she gained at Canterbury. The end of the school happened in September of 1834 after a particularly violent attack that broke every window in the school. There had been, as I mentioned, anti-abolitionist riots in New York and Philadelphia, and some of those had led to sexual assault, as well as at least one death in Philadelphia. And at this point, trying to keep a school that was open under those circumstances was simply not tenable for the safety of all involved. But the end is not really the end of the school, which was for me some of the most exciting work to do. Often when the story is told, it's told as though it's Prudence Crandall's story alone. Interestingly, Prudence Crandall never said that. She always credited Mariah Davis and Sarah Harris. A single hero rests on a very slippery slope to being perceived as a white savior. And really, if we start to see Canterbury as a chorus of heroes, it becomes multidimensional and prismatic. It becomes what it was, part of a movement for social change. And part of that is reflected in the cover of my book. Instead of putting Crandall on the cover again, I put 3 Black women associated with the school. Sarah Harris Fairweather, the first student. She goes on to marry George Fairweather, who is a tradesman and a blacksmith and artist. Her home in Western Rhode Island becomes a stop on the abolitionist circuit. She saw Frederick Douglass every year and exchanged a fruitcake with the Garrisons every year because they all stopped by her house. So she became a movement activist. On the far right-hand side is her sister, Mary Harris, who marries a fellow educator, Pelham Williams. For a while, they're teaching in the New London area, and then they move to New Orleans once the Union has taken New Orleans back during the Civil War. They're involved in setting up Straight University, and their sons become involved in the music teaching in the area that helps to foment the birth of American jazz. The woman in the middle, Maricha Lyons, was not a student at the school. She is the niece of one of the students, Gloria Catherine Marshall. And Maricha Lyons becomes one of the first memory bearers in the African American community, keeping the story of the school alive by writing capsule biographies of 2 of the students, Sarah Harris and Elizabeth Brown Smith. I was able to trace out many of the children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren of students from Canterbury. My favorite of these stories, there's plenty more of them, and I urge you to read the book, but my favorite involves a student named Amy Fenner, who married into a family that resulted in Fritz Pollard Jr. Football fans will be familiar with Fritz Pollard Sr., who was the first Black coach in the NFL prior to when the NFL became segregated. He's actually in the Football Hall of Fame. His son, Fritz Pollard Jr., is the direct lineal descendant of Amy Fenner. And he was also a football player, but he was a track and field star who went on to join the American track and field team for the famous 1936 Olympics. The Berlin Olympics, which were supposed to be Hitler's Olympics to prove white supremacy, and instead we know it as the Jesse Owens Olympics. Yes, Fritz Pollard Jr. was a teammate of Jesse Owens, and in one of the events that Jesse Owens got the gold, Fritz Pollard Jr. took home the bronze. The Burley family and the Unionist are part of the digital projects that were mentioned in the introduction. And they are certainly spin-offs from this, from the book itself, and that also lead to many important local history pieces and the national abolitionist trends that they were a part of. So I thank you for your attention tonight. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. And now let's go out and change the world like these women and men, black and white, did before us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was wonderful. And please, I encourage folks to read the book, which gets into even more depth about these wonderful stories and this great history of people who sought to change the world. And in many ways, they did. We've got some questions coming in. I encourage those in the audience to use our Q&A function to ask your questions. I'll start with one, and then I'm going to turn to ones in the Q&A. You've been studying Prudence Crandall in one way or another for more than 2 decades. How has your sense of this story changed over the time that you have been studying it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, first of all, I started out thinking biographically. And because my home discipline is in religious studies, I was particularly fascinated by her religious biography. Crandall starts as a Quaker, becomes a Baptist, makes the mistake of marrying a Baptist preacher after that. But he had some in-laws who were Unitarians and Universalists. She worked with Unitarians. Then she becomes a spiritualist. Then she consults a Christian Science healer. So I thought that sounds like pretty much every way station a progressive white woman could occupy in the 19th century religiously. But then when I started to think about this story, I thought, here is a story filled with African Americans who are not getting top billing. That doesn't make sense. And it struck me almost immediately when I read Crandall's accounts of the school as an early experiment in anti-racism, particularly because the American feminist movement took a wrong turn on issues of race, especially after the Civil War was over and there was the fight over the amendments and who was going to get the right to vote first. And there was a lot of racist language. And to me, the Canterbury story indicates it didn't have to be that way, that there were other avenues being taken. Then when I stumbled across the fact that African Americans had remembered the Crandall story more accurately and more fully into the late 19th century than white Americans had, I knew that my hunch wasn't wrong. Early on in my journeys in studying Crandall, I came across that piece of gold that all researchers want, which is I found a letter of hers that had been previously unknown. It was the last letter from her pen. It was to William Lloyd Garrison's children. And in it, she says, I make sure to take newspapers written by the colored people themselves so I can see what they are thinking. And I would put it to the audience today, how many 80-plus-year-old women and white women in Kansas are reading the Black press now, let alone them. And so I knew then this was a more important story that we needed to know in its fullness.
Great, thank you. Several of the questions we have deal in one way or another with the sources and the material culture behind your story. Susie Ryan, hi Susie, who's a member and leader in Sisters in Stitches, Joined by the Cloth here in New England, asks, are the photos used in your presentation the actual pictures of the Black women featured in your book?
There are very few pictures we have of the students when they were younger. But the ones that I've used tonight of Sarah Harris and Mary Harris are of those actual women. The women that I show in that little vignette of the trial, those were not the students. Some of them are related to them. For instance, one is a sister of a student there, but those were just a little vignette. There is one other student that I don't think I showed tonight who is the student who was discovered after the book went to press. And the University of Illinois Press, much to their credit, was sweet enough to include a postscript on an empty page about this discovery. And I do have a picture of her where she is a younger woman. So she might have only been out of the school for 5 to 10 years. But these women were generally not wealthy enough to have their portraits done. And so we're dependent on early photographs. And in many cases, those came from later in their lives. But yes, we are still on the search for photographs of their families. We have more photographs of their husbands, not surprisingly.
And of course, 1832, 1833, 1834 is very early for the technology of photography itself. So any photographs we would
Yeah,
have of these women would almost certainly be from after the school itself, just because of the
exactly.
technology. Yeah.
Mhm.
Debbie Schaefer Jacobs says that Fairweather Hall at URI, University of Rhode Island, is named for Sarah Harris Fairweather, and her papers are in their archives. Her question is if there are any material culture remaining from the school, reading materials, etc.
There is there aren't any things like logbooks or grade books, which I would love to see. Obviously, those would have more names on them. But I think that might be due to the secrecy and anonymity that I mentioned earlier. Uh, what we do have that are remnants from the school are largely at the school itself, including a Bible that was sent from women in Glasgow, Scotland, who were abolitionists, that was sent to recognize what Crandall was doing. We have a gift that was sent by one of the Philadelphia students, one of the Johnson sisters, to Crandall after the school had to close. We have a number of artifacts that have been found in archaeological digs at the museum that are from the era of the school, including some sewing materials. And there's also a lot of broken glass. And I include a picture of that in the book. It's very hard to date the precise year for broken glass, but there were large amounts of it. And knowing that the final attack on the school was one that broke every window, there's a high statistical chance that that material is actually from the time. The letters have fared better. Many of the letters are in either the collection of Boston Public. The ones that were sent to William Lloyd Garrison, for instance, are there. And other letters of the students have been preserved largely through the pages of the newspapers. And we are greatly aided in the 21st century um, by these newspapers being digitized and therefore searchable. So many new strands have been uncovered. We discovered, for instance, many of the marriages of students that way by being able to really go through the pages of the Colored American, which was the black newspaper published in New York in the late 1830s.
Great, thank you. Diana Korzanek asks, who owned the grand building that housed the Canterbury Academy?
Great question. It was actually Crandall and her family purchased it. Was the town owned it? They purchased it outright. When the school closed, it had to go on the market again, and at some loss, as you can imagine, because it wasn't in great condition at that point. In addition to being infamous, and one of the local white abolitionist sympathizers, William Kinney, purchased it and held it until it could be purchased by a new buyer. But Crandall was in a great deal of debt. I don't know what her personal situation was in terms of what her personal economics were at that point, but obviously she had lost her livelihood. And then her new husband, who she married just a month before the school closed, he turned out to be not a very good money guy, who was very willing to spend other people's money, but not willing to save his home. And so she went in debt to her good friend Samuel J. May. And there's a nice story about that, which is she partially repaid him by giving him the portrait that was painted of her by Francis Alexander, who was a leading portrait painter of the time. And he later gave that portrait to Cornell University when they opened, and they agreed to take his papers. And he said, "You're going to admit women, right?" And when Andrew White said yes, he said, "Well, you can have the portrait then." And the portrait hangs to this day in the rare book room at Cornell.
That's a wonderful story. Diana Korzanek goes on to say, bravo for amazing research, and asks you to describe the museum, the Prudence Crandall
Ah,
Museum.
yes. Yeah, the Prudence Crandall Museum is where the actual school was held, and I will admit to sometimes getting chills about that when I'm there. And it has only had two curators in its entire history. It opened in the early 1990s. The state purchased the house, I believe, in the mid 1970s. Um, so it's only had two curators, which is wonderful because there's great continuity in how the site has been cared for. There are quite a few, as I say, small artifacts of the time. It's also an archaeological site, and there have been at least 3 digs there. The museum has recently been redesigned with hanging banners, and I am pleased with this because recently, for instance, I found a picture that we previously didn't know of the Burley daughter, Mary Burley, who taught at the school. And I sent that word to the current curator, Joni DiMartino. She had it up by the afternoon on a poster. So that was really nice. And Historic Northampton, who holds it, was only too happy to share it. So that was wonderful news. So the history is being documented. And 3 of us, myself, Manisha Sinha, and Cabria Baumgartner, have helped to really retell the story as thoroughly as we can. And the museum has been more than happy to work with us. The museum tries to have an annual kind of seminar where they bring scholars together to discuss the latest research and allied research. And it's open right now. It's only open for tours on Sunday, but once the spring happens, it will be open, I believe, at least 5 days a week. And but it has the problems of an old house. There was, for instance, a ceiling that partially collapsed recently. So there's all the problems associated with an old house, but it's wonderful. And you really do get a flavor of what it would have felt like. And also just how close that hostile congregational church was. It's right across the street.
And your mention of the hostile congregational church leads us to the other question we have here from Richard Candy, who loves how you've changed the Crandall school story. But listening to the story of how the white opponents expressed their prejudice was reminiscent of actions that we might hear today and words we might hear today.
Yes, Richard, you are right. It was, shall we say, it was an anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion episode in American history. And indeed, there was a lot of simple prejudice, but there was also the more complex kind that, well, who really needs this advanced education? Because the education these students were receiving was closer to a kind of an AP high school level or maybe first year or junior college level than elementary ABCs. By this point, in Connecticut at least, most African Americans were free and most African Americans could attend district schools. But higher education was not supposed to be made available. And during the hullabaloo about the 1831 Manual Labor College in New Haven, a particularly racist newspaper editor in New York, James Watson Webb, actually wrote, "Of what use is it for a coachman to know Horace or mathematics?" So the idea was that certain people, by virtue of their future job descriptions, could be denied access to the shared legacy of humankind. And I just think that's wrong. I think it's as wrong now as it was then. And what gives me some hope is that the political outlook in 1833, when the school started, was just as bleak as ours is now. And let us be blunt here, Black men, Black women, and white women had no reasonable hope of gaining the vote soon to change that in 1833. And indeed, it would be another 30 years minimum before they did have the vote. So, yet they still were creating change. They still were political actors. And I want us to be thinking along those lines right now because I frankly am concerned about the future of American democracy. And as I said at the beginning, I'm deeply concerned that the attack has moved into attacks on archives and attacks on universities. So yeah, I do see a parallel.
And we'll end with a question that comes from Gloria Mengual, which also draws on this parallel. She writes that I worked as the DEI educator for the CREC Open Choice Program, which places Hartford youth attending primarily white suburban school districts in 27 towns surrounding Hartford. She retired last year after 7 years attempting to educate suburban teachers and school administrators about the history of racism in education. And says, I'll just summarize this. She retired wondering if it would have been better to invest in addressing the systemic inequities within Hartford schools rather than send our kiddos to suburban school districts where they face so much racism. Nearly 200 years later, the racism is exploding once again. What can we pull from the brave efforts of the past and apply those learnings today to make progress on systemic racism in education in this country?
Okay, so we end with the
It's a
$64,000
big
question. All right.
question.
But I do appreciate it. I really do. I think the first thing is that urgency about wanting to learn and about needing to learn. And I was very uplifted by that moment in the Super Bowl, which is why it's in my slideshow, when Kendrick Lamar was right there at the same time that the president of the United States was there. And that now a number of teachers have put out study guides of all of the Black history embedded in that show. That part of this is simply, I think part of the struggle is recognizing how African American history is American history. And we all know that, but stating it over and over again and bringing up some of these stories that are new stories or that we haven't heard as much. And by recentering the Canterbury narrative for schools in Connecticut, where Prudence Crandall is the state heroine, this is built in, right? I mean, in other words, it's almost noble and good civic education to talk about Prudence Crandall in Connecticut. And so I'm hoping that there will be educators who will take advantage of this. And I'm also planning on working with the team at the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale, who are doing curriculum outreach and want to build a unit around what's happening with Canterbury. So I'm hoping that sharing these stories will help, but also just valuing education and understanding it is how I just described it, that this is the legacy of all humankind. And no one should be left out of that story, because to leave anybody out is to be dishonest about the totality of history. I mean, I have felt that since I was a child. You know, it's like, we've got to include everybody, right? And lo and behold, I've been surprised more often than I want to be, but I'm going to persist in the same way they did. And I hope you will too, in other venues, perhaps. And, you know, I know my own sister was a school librarian in the Hartford public school system. And she actually gave me a whole lot of leads on African-American literature because she did her anti-racist homework as the librarian for a school that was a no majority school racially. So we just need to keep the informal conversations going in order to formalize them later. So
Jennifer
thanks for the
Rycenga.
question. Yes.
Jennifer Rycenga, thank you so much for doing this work, for writing this book, and talking with us tonight. I will repeat that the book is Schooling the Nation, The Success of the Canterbury Academy for Black Women. It's just out from the University of Illinois Press. In the chat, there is a way to get a copy at a reduced price from the publisher. If you'd like to recommend this program to your friends, all of our public programs are made available on the AIS YouTube channel. It should be available in the next few days. I hope that lots of people will watch this program and use this in their classes as well, along with the kinds of curricular materials that Jennifer hopes to create, and I hope that happens. We have a lot of programs coming up this spring. You can check them out on the AIS website. I'll mention two just now. 2 weeks from tonight, on Thursday, March 20th, we have a hybrid program that is in person here at Antiquarian Hall and also live streaming on the trials of Madame Restel, 19th century America's most famous female physician and the campaign to make abortion a crime, with author Nicholas Syrett. And then on April 11th and 12th, we have a series of events here at AAS commemorating the 200th anniversary of our founder, Isaiah Thomas, bringing his printing press to Worcester in 1775. We have a symposium with new insights on Thomas on Friday afternoon, April 11th. And then we have an open house here at AAS on Saturday afternoon, April 12th. We'll be having demonstrations of printing on an replica 18th century press, tours of the American Antiquarian Society, behind the scenes, and an opportunity to look at some of the collections. Please join us for all of that. Jennifer Rycenga, thank you so much again. Thanks to all of you for watching, and have a good evening.